Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us for this important session. My name is Kristen Clark and I'm the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And this is no doubt a historic day. As many of you know, Congress took action this morning to introduce the Justice in Policing Act of 2020. And I'm very pleased that we're joined by an exceptional lineup of experts who will provide an overview of this most important bill. Before we do that, however, I just want to say about a word about the moment that we find ourselves in. There is important work to do, but I do want to take just a brief moment to acknowledge the pain of communities that care deeply about police violence and racial violence, and families that are grieving the loss of loved ones. The family of George Floyd, the family of Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Tamir Rice, and the list goes on. My hope is that while we are at a crossroads in our nation, that this might be a moment that propels us forward. And no doubt the important work that Congress is undertaking right now to help advance long overdue reforms is critical to the fight that lies ahead. To help spearhead this discussion, I'm honored that we are joined by Congresswoman Karen Bass, the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, a distinguished member of the House Judiciary Committee, and one to whom we owe much credit for moving with all deliberate speed to put this important legislation in place with the aid and support of Senators Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and other members of the CBC. Chairwoman Bass, thank you for joining us. We know that you kicked things off with a press conference with colleagues this morning. We'll dive into the details of the bill later during this program, but I was hoping that you could share some words at the outset to talk about this moment that we're in.
Sure. Well, as you know, one thing for me to say, it gives me a flashback to 1973 when I was a member of an organization in Los Angeles called the Coalition Against Police Abuse. And we had a crazy situation in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is always a little crazy, but it was really bad then. And to think of all of the years and all of the people who have died at the hands of police since then, that 47 years later, I would be a member of Congress, something I absolutely never envisioned, and would stand up there on a stage today and unveil a bill that is very, very bold and that we're going to have to work to get through and work to make sure it passes. But one that I'm proud to say makes some very significant changes. And I know we'll get into the bill in a bit. But what I am so inspired by, all those years we had marches and got our police chief fired finally and all, I am so inspired to see the thousands of people around the country. And I feel like we have a moral moment in front of us. And it's our job to grab onto that energy and to take that energy and to channel it into very substantial change.
Excellent. And we know that this bill by itself will not fully address the crisis that's in front of us. We know that policing is very much local and that there is important work that will play out on the ground in communities across our country. We know that communities have agency and need to have voice in helping to reshape and reimagine what policing looks like in our country. So I'm extremely excited about this moment that we're in, but I know that we can't put all of our faith in resolving this through one bill. It will take all of us. It will take political will. It will take the courage of prosecutors to do the right thing to really get this right. So with that, we'll move into our discussion, and I just want to say a brief word about our experts who've joined us here today. We are joined by Cami Chavis, who is an expert on criminal justice reform and a professor at Wake Forest Law School. We're also joined by Alvin Bragg, who is a former federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. He spent a number of years at the New York Attorney General's office serving as Deputy Attorney General where he helped to oversee that office's important work when they undertook the role of serving as an independent prosecutor in police shootings of unarmed people in New York State. He's currently a professor at New York Law School. And we're also joined by Roy Austin, an attorney at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis. He's a former federal prosecutor in the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's criminal section, where he prosecuted police misconduct cases, handling cases from New Orleans to Maricopa, Arizona, and many places in between, and served for some time on the 21st Century Policing Task Force under the Obama administration. Thanks all of you for joining us today. I want to turn to talking about the bill, and I think I want to start first by talking about communities, because one of the reasons that we're here, no doubt, is because of the persistence of hundreds of thousands of people who have activated across the country and across the globe who are saying enough's enough and that the time for reform is now. Let's talk about provisions in the bill that empower communities and give communities a voice and say in the policing reform work that lies ahead. Congresswoman Bass, can I start with you?
Sure. In terms of what lies ahead in police reform?
And the role for communities. I understand that there are parts of the bill, for example, that deal with civilian review boards.
Yes, well, I actually want to pick up on something that you said a few minutes ago about re-envisioning, because there's a part of the bill that deals with that as well, that provides grants to community-based organizations so that they can come up with pilot projects or whatever to re-envision what policing is like, what is public safety in your community. And I have been involved with that for many, many years in Los Angeles, trying to come up with ways to address crime that doesn't involve incarceration, doesn't involve policing, but gets at the root reasons why, the root causes as to why there is crime. So the other thing, a few other features about the bill, and I know we'll be spending time going through in depth, but as you mentioned, you know, civilian involvement, but having a national registry so that Tamir Rice would have graduated high school this month. You know, he was 12 years old. 6 years ago, that police officer had been fired by a nearby police department, and he lied when he was hired. Well, what if you had a national registry? But one of the other things that I think is really important about the bill is the training and raising the standard of police like any other profession, where you have to be certified, where you go to for continuing education, where there's national standards. So things like that I feel all work together, which is why I'm good. It is one bill, as opposed to some people have asked us, why didn't you do a lot of bills? That's when things get very messy. And I like the fact that it's all contained in one bill.
Others?
So this is, I don't think that you can understate what this bill does with respect to civilian review boards. Actually gives them some teeth. We see models of this all over the country, different levels of authority, different levels of review. But in this bill, it particularly says that to be accredited, they must have investigatory authority and staff subpoena power. That is huge because too many of these rely on voluntary compliance by their law enforcement agency. Too many of these rely on just hope and a dream. But this one actually provides them the ability to go in and ask the hard questions and actually get the answers that they want. And that really brings the community, the civilians, into how they are being policed.
You know, one of the reasons why we're here is because of white supremacy and racism and the legacy of slavery. And I want to make sure that we are very intentional in addressing the way in which this bill speaks to that reality. Can we talk a bit about the ban on racial profiling and other provisions of the bill that really aim to deal with the way in which race infects policing in our country?
So when I took a look at the bill and I saw, the In Racial Profiling Act, right, embedded in this bill, it is historic. One of the things that we know is that in almost every jurisdiction where we have the data shows that African Americans are stopped more than their white counterparts. And even though there are often, even when we see those disparities, even if there still are some legal hurdles to proving the intent necessary to have equal protection claim, having that data is so important. It shows you the disparities, and it can actually, one interesting thing is that we can look at jurisdictions that are doing well and say, well, you don't have the same disparities. What are you doing? What practices are you implementing in that jurisdiction to not have the racial profiling that's been so prevalent in other jurisdictions? And it can help us figure out where we need to train and what we need to train officers on.
You're on mute, Christian.
Well,
you're on mute. So I'll just go ahead and say, just from sitting here in New York and thinking about the role of the data in the the historic Floyd litigation, it can't be, it's impossible to overstate the role of data. It's as Cammie said, there's an educational component, but at the end of the day, when you need to sue someone and make the claim, the data speaks volumes, and we saw it in Floyd. And when Chris and I were together at the Attorney General's office, we crunched data that complemented that and showed, just in and of itself, the staggering low number of stops percentage-wise. 0.1% of the stops in New York resulted in a conviction for a violent crime, and that really helped debunk the operating thesis of the police department here of why they were doing the stops.
I want to turn to talking about accountability, because I think that is a really critical piece of this. And I know, Congresswoman Bass, that there are many people that feel that cops kill with impunity, that is just the standard that's been in place for far too long. Talk about the parts of the bill that may change that and result in a world in which we start to see officers criminally prosecuted when they use excessive or deadly force without basis.
Well, exactly right. And I think that's, has been the case. So the idea that we could deal with qualified immunity, that is very, very important. The idea that you can't prosecute, you can't sue, you can't fire police officers, all of those things are very, very important. The use of force reporting. But then I think one of the other things that will be the carrot, both the carrot and the stick to police departments, because that the bill does not have any new money for police departments. But on the other hand, if a police department doesn't institute reforms, doesn't raise the standards, then they also can't get resources. And I think that that's always a very important thing to do. And hopefully beginning to change the culture of policing. So all of that, I believe, are important first steps, dealing with reforming the grand jury, several bills that people have fought for over time, now all putting those pieces together, I think is going to make a big difference.
Yeah, when it comes to accountability, I think the changes that have been made to 18 United States Code 242 stand out to me personally, and Kristen, probably you personally as well, as former criminal section attorneys. This is the statute that allows federal prosecutors to go in and to prosecute instances of police brutality. And they have had their hands tied behind their back for decades now, with a statute that only allows them to go after willful conduct. Now the language has changed to reckless, knowingly or with reckless disregard. This is the kind of statute that would have allowed the Department of Justice and the fine prosecutors who work there in the Civil Rights Division to prosecute the Eric Garner case. It would have allowed them to come behind in Minnesota and prosecute the Philando Castillo case. It is so important that we don't have this standard that is so high that it prevents police from being held accountable when they should be held accountable.
Let me mention one other feature, Kristen, that I don't believe has gotten a lot of attention, but the idea that the attorney generals in states could get grants to explore ways, to break up the whole DA situation. It's just a structural conflict of interest for the DA office, who works every day with the police department, to then press charges against police officers. So I think that kind of goes along with the movement that is happening around the country to hire more progressive DAs. But, DA offices have hundreds of lawyers too. So the idea that we could give them an additional tool of an incentive in a state to try to deal with that, hopefully will make a difference as well.
And
Represent.
I want to ask you to jump in and give some real life perspective on how this has worked in New York. The idea of taking the cases away from the local DA and to somebody who might be more fair, impartial, and independent.
Yeah. So first, I wanted to thank Representative Bass. When I picked up the bill, this is the part that jumped out to me the most. It is critically important. We've had research on this, from years, scholarly writing, like policing the Black man. We've had now this experiment in New York, but to have the federal government speak and incentivize localities this way, I think speaks volumes. So in New York, like Kristen said, I was at the Attorney General's office and was operating under an executive order by the governor. And it was exactly on the premise, Representative Bass, you just said, that we didn't want the local district attorneys who work day in and day out with the police department to then have to prosecute a member. And people asked me when we had the position, said, well, this is anti-law enforcement, you don't trust. So, well, no, one, it's about the perception of independence as well as about independence. So it's a structural integrity mechanism. But then we have to also acknowledge that there are times when it isn't just the perception of integrity, it is the integrity. So when I was in this role, I think one of the most sobering things of my career, we had a district attorney in our state who convened a grand jury, and within 5 days, and we know that it's very difficult to get a whole grand jury in 5 days on this kind of a case, cleared the one and only shooter of an unarmed Black motorist, was fired at 8 times and killed. We came behind under special authority from the governor and investigated the district attorney. The case is on appeal, so I won't go into it too much, but we ended up charging the sitting district attorney, not an assistant district, but sitting district attorney, with official misconduct and with perjury and other things in connection with his investigation of this unarmed shooting. So this is critically important. And anytime anyone says, oh, this is perception, this is just semantics, it is not true. The experience from New York shows that we critically need this bill. And so thank you for leading in this way.
And I just wanted to say, because Representative Bass, you mentioned just the culture of police departments. And one thing that I would like to say about this bill is that it really strikes that we know that we have these individual instances that we see, splashed across the news and folks that have been harmed, but it's an indication of something in the culture of policing. And almost every provision of this bill really strikes at changing the culture from officers, law enforcement agencies being an occupying force to really being an institution that protects and actually serves the community. So I just wanted to say that.
One of the big issues that we have tried to tackle throughout the years is you might have an instance where an officer is actually held to account and loses their job, but then can quickly get hired in a state next door. What does the bill do to address that crisis, that issue?
Mentioning it earlier, it provides our calls for a national registry. So, again, Tamir Rice's killer, he would be alive today if the police chief knew the truth. Now, I'm making an assumption, but I do think, and I think that how we talk about this bill, that it is not an anti-police bill. I mean, what I said is that what police chief would want to hire somebody that they knew was unstable or abusive, but they didn't necessarily know, so the guy lied. And I think that it would be very good for that police chief if he, I'm assuming it was a he, had had the ability to interview this officer, and then he checked the National Registry, and it showed that he had had problems. So that's one of the most important things that the bill does to address that.
We're getting some very good questions from participants who I encourage to continue using the Q&A box. And I want to try to weave in some of these themes, but let's talk a little bit more about police unions, because I do think that this is a very critical issue, understanding how collective bargaining agreements that may be in place in police departments to make it a little difficult to put in place some of these reforms on the ground.
So another piece of this bill that I love is what it does with respect to delays in reporting to internal affairs, and having the Attorney General put his or her thumb on the finger of what this research really tells us. As we know, in far too many agreements with police unions, officers are allowed to wait 24 to 48 hours before giving a statement about an incident that they were involved in. I want those officers, I want the union to explain to the American people why a trained law enforcement officer needs 48 hours to give a statement when there's not a single civilian in this country that is given 48 hours, a chance to meet with their friends, meet with their attorney, before they give a statement about what they just witnessed. Why a trained police officer should be able to do that. And there are other delays, and why does it take 3 and 4 years and longer for an internal affairs investigation to be completed? This bill addresses that and has the AG, and the AG will provide a report on that and will explain to the American people, an AG that actually cares about these issues and is willing to fight for the American people, will put out a reasonable report, a reasoned report, let me say as well, and really put these issues in front of the American people and ask them, and not just rely on the union's word that some of these protections, these very special protections for police officers, need to be there.
We got a question about standards and whether there will be national standards for policing and training that are put in place. And can you speak to that, Congresswoman Bass?
Sure. Well, that is a provision of the bill, calling for national standards and really calling for, I mean, you can't be a teacher, lawyer, doctor, I mean, you name it, that you don't have national standards, national certification, ongoing, continuing education. That's why, once again, this is not an anti-police bill. I would assume that police officers would want to upgrade the profession. And so having national standards, I think, is something that is a very important feature of the bill.
Others?
I was just going to say that, I mean, I think, again, having national standards, particularly on things when we're thinking about what types of use of force is appropriate. A chokehold in Minneapolis has the same impact as a chokehold in North Carolina as in New York. So there should be some uniform training standards. And again, one thing that I really like about this bill is that there are lots of provisions where there is flexibility for, the bill. It will create a baseline and then flexibility for states and local governments to come in and tailor some things. But this is one of those places where we know we don't need differences. And so a chokehold in Minneapolis, the same thing as a chokehold in North Carolina.
And let me
I was just to add to that, it's even sometimes can be police departments side by side, right? Within the state of New York, we've got great variation. And so it's very impactful in driving departments who may be close to one another physically, but not having coordinated and driving states to think harder about getting coordination and baselines.
I just wanted to add in, just using the chokehold as an example. Why on earth does any department use a chokehold? I mean, I was listening to a doctor the other day say, and this is a training issue, the police think if you say, I can't breathe, that means as long as you can say that, you can breathe, and you're just faking. Simple training could explain to a police officer that you can still verbalize those words and be dying. And so I think things like that, why would they even use that? How could it be okay in one, in one jurisdiction and not another? So looking at some police tactics to say that's inappropriate, period. I don't care where it is. And so to me, when I think of national standards, I think of it in that context too. An opportunity to review some of the things that they're doing that they shouldn't do at all.
And some of those, I would point out, I mean, you have the no-knock warrant in
Right.
drug.
That's another one.
Why should any police department
Right.
be able to move forward with a no-knock warrant in a drug case? It's not necessary, and it's led to a lot of harm. It's led to some deaths in this country. It shouldn't happen. Similarly, the duty to intervene.
Right.
I had an opportunity recently to look back at the Rodney King tape. And you have the 4 officers there swinging at him with their clubs like baseball bats, and you have a bunch of officers just standing around watching them. We recently saw a tape out of Buffalo, New York,
Right.
where the man gets shoved to the ground, and all these officers just
Walk by him.
the man who is bleeding out of his ear in the back of his head. It is unbelievable that officers don't have a duty to intervene when they see wrongdoing on the part of some of their fellow officers and do nothing in these situations. I mean, to protect and serve, it's got to mean to protect and serve everyone, and wherever you see that kind of harm happening, and that's the kind of national standards, or those are the kinds of national standards that I think we'll see coming out of it.
And to be clear, the bill includes a ban on chokeholds, a ban on neck holds, and restrictions on no-knock warrants. So these are issues addressed by this bill.
And I was just going to say one thing about the duty to intervene. You know, we talk a lot of folks have heard about the code of silence, right? And so in terms of police officers, good officers seeing something that's happened and having either some fear of retaliation or knowledge that nobody's going to be disciplined anyway. So the training on a duty to intervene, really, if we can inculcate that in people, then that would go much further to knowing that everybody is watching. When someone's watching you, you behave differently.
But as someone who's sort of thinking about it, go ahead, Kristen, I'm sorry.
I was going to move us in a slightly different direction because there are a few folks who've raised questions about calls to whether this bill is a good alternative to recent calls that have been made to defund the police. And I think there are some of us who believe that we probably in some communities spend way too much on policing and don't put enough into the other social service and other needs that communities have. So Congresswoman Bass, I was hoping you could speak to this issue.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that at the core of the issue is what you described. It's how communities' resources are spent. And I always use the comparison with the federal budget. We always complain that there is too much money spent in defense. And the Defense Department, sometimes we give them money that they don't even ask for things that they don't even want. And so our priorities are upside down. When it comes to local police, if somebody says, well, you need the police because you have so much crime in this area, well, I have a novel approach. How about find out why there's so much crime? How about find out what's going on? Because if we look at the whole Get Tough era on crime, in my opinion, we contributed to crime problems because mass incarceration did. 85% of the people who are incarcerated come home. And we have passed so many crazy laws that ban them from participating in the legal economy, which then boosts the illegal economy. So some of our policies that we did years ago have unintended consequences. And so part of this movement is to re-envision policing. And I believe I mentioned it before. I like the fact that in the bill, it provides grants to communities so they can come up with pilot projects to say, why do we have a public safety problem? Can we address it through the root causes? And it's beginning to challenge how city budgets are put together. And I hope that we look at it on the federal side as well. To me, that is different than saying we need to eliminate the police and we need to cancel all funding for police departments. I support getting at the underlying issues and increasing massively support in communities. Let me just make one other point. The Congressional Black Caucus, obviously we're laser focused on this today, but we also have this massive bill called Jobs and Justice that gets at some of the other problems that are happening in our community. If we can't get that investment from shifting police resources, we need to look for other resources as well.
Right. Do other folks want to talk about this? This is kind of has been a big few days, but you know, I think about mental illness, for example, and how we've started to use jails as mental health treatment centers in many communities. And it, you know, really, I think underscores the need for us to stop criminalizing mental illness in our country and put more investment into treating people with mental health needs.
Right. There was a particular locality where they were doing an assessment, thinking about our jail is too small, where the jail is overcrowded. And when they actually took a look at why it was overcrowded, it was because there were so many people that had mental illness, and they were using it as a warehouse for those people. And then ultimately, after that assessment, they were able to have a smaller facility because most of the people weren't criminals at all. They just needed mental health assistance.
There's also the reality of the federal government having, you know, limited impact on state and local. And you need to be able to use your burn jag money, your COPS money, your 1033 as a way to incentivize good behavior. And so if you remove all of the federal funding, if you just go in there and snatch all the federal funding from state and local law enforcement, then the federal government loses a lot of its power to change these departments. So I think it is important that we consider that at this time as we look for exactly what Cammie was talking about. Basically, the thought we always had was if they build it, they will fill it. And then you have all these sheriff's offices and others who are incentivized because they get a per dollar amount per prisoner they keep in their facilities. So we have to look at ways to remove the financial incentives to lock people up, while at the same time using the tools we have as a federal government to impact state and local.
Yeah, I agree completely with Roy. You know, coming from the perspective of someone who's been in state government, the power of the federal purse is strong. And the way I look at these initiatives is, let's do the exact opposite of the '94 crime bill, right? The federal government created these incentives, which led to a lot of these problems. We can use the power of the purse to do the reverse.
So Congresswoman Bass, we've got some county attorneys and local folks on the ground who I think are eager to figure out how they can be put to work while the bill makes its way through Congress. What would be your charge to what folks?
Oh, I so appreciate the question. We definitely need to expand the support. I mean, we just dropped the bill today. I'm very happy to tell you that we have Senate and House together, over 200 co-sponsors. It would be great to double that number. And so everybody who is listening to this call right now can call their representative and say, I need you to co-sponsor this bill. We also need to create, you know, an environment for a number of members of Congress. I mean, we've been in this mindset for so many decades that elected officials are worried about signing on to a bill that is going to get tagged as anti-police. I don't believe that it is at all. And so for people to have courage, because this is a moment. This is a moment, and they don't come often. And so we have to make a difference and go through the door while we have a little crack in it. So increasing the support, and then if there's groups that you want members of Congress to talk to like this, we're more than happy to do that. Your professional associations, Greek associations, all of those signing on and in support of the bill would just be phenomenal.
We also have a question about citizens' arrest, and knowing that Ahmaud Arbery died at the hands of a citizen's arrest. Should there be reform of citizen arrest statutes? But that also, this question also reminds me of a provision that's kind of tucked away at the bottom of the bill the Anti-Lynching Act, which speaks to this racial violence problem that we have in the country. I know, Congresswoman, that you may be catching a flight soon. Do you want to speak to that piece of the bill and leave us with any final thoughts?
Sure. First of all, I'm really glad that that piece was in the bill because that was a classic case. I mean, you can just think of the 1920s when anybody decided that they could just go hunt a black person, which is what that was. And that guy was an ex-law enforcement officer. He apparently was still working with law enforcement in some kind of way. I'm sure it'll be discovered in the trial. But and then what happened to George Floyd? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, both of those were lynchings. And so I think that it's important that it was put in the bill, especially with this rise in white supremacist groups, these militia groups. It's very important. Or even the protests that happened in D.C. with all of these mysterious men. Nobody knows, as far as I know, nobody knows who they were. They had no badges on. They had all of this equipment that they could have purchased from anywhere. For all we know, they could have been militias. So I think that was a very important part of the bill. Let me just end and say goodbye by thanking you so much, Kristen, for your leadership. Your leadership, your guidance throughout this. I hope to continue calling on you. And as I listen to all of your guests, I am going to have to email you back because I want everybody's information because I know that I could call on all of you, and I know some of you I've met before. But thank you so much. We got to get this across the finish line. We have got to capture the energy from all these protests, and everybody that's listening on the call, we have to get this done. It's been just way too long.
Thank you for being with us. Consider us your kitchen table throughout this process.
I need it.
Things don't move quickly in Congress, but this certainly did, and no doubt to you goes much the credit. So thank you for your leadership and responding to the urgency of the moment.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
So Roy, I want to go to you next. There are thousands of police departments across the country. And one question that has come up is whether this is a bill that speaks to urban police departments, or whether this is indeed a bill that addresses policing in every corner of our country.
So you say thousands. Yes, there are approximately 18,000 police departments around this country. And this bill speaks to every single one of them. And I do want to say, we didn't have to be here right now. President Obama had his task force on 21st century policing, which is called out in this bill. And if departments had simply looked at that and done those things, I don't think we would have been here today because they could have fixed this problem themselves. But this bill, when you're talking about it, and we talked about this before, a chokehold that happens in New York is the same as a chokehold that happens in Minnesota, is the same as a restriction on breathing that happens in any small town in this country. The same thing goes for no-knock warrants. The same thing goes for the duty to intervene. The same thing goes for pretty much everything about this bill is to make policing better. And there's no place in this country, whether you are an urban area with a very diverse group of citizens, or you are a more rural area with a less diverse group of citizens, that policing can't be better, that police officers cannot emphasize that they are guardians and not warriors, that they cannot emphasize that they're going to treat every single one of their citizens, regardless of race, of color, of ethnicity, of sexual orientation, of income, the same. And so this is called out for not just by urban areas, but by the entire country. And this is going to make our entire country much safer.
So I want to do a quick round robin. Favorite part of the bill, the piece of the bill that you have the most hope will do the most work to really upend policing in our country and truly transform policing in ways that produce more fair, just, and equitable outcomes for communities, particularly for African Americans and people of color.
I'm going to cheat because I have said for years that no one thing is a panacea. So I think we need every single one of these provisions. I think we have needed them for so long, and I think that they all work together for good and to keep officers accountable. But I talked a little bit about the racial profiling and the data collection there. But I think another part is the role that technology plays. And so there is the body-worn camera provision. And what I liked about that is, so many jurisdictions, and there's already a lot of federal money being given to local police departments to purchase the cameras and develop policies around them. But what I like about this bill is that it addresses the privacy concerns that so many of us have about, in particularly when we think about Black and brown communities already being over surveilled. But those cameras are necessary for the accountability, and this bill balances that by speaking to the privacy concerns, by saying that you're not going to equip these officers with facial recognition, which we know is really unreliable for Black people of color. You're not going to do that without a warrant. And then it is another one of these provisions where it specifically says you are not going to, as a local community, implement the use of these technologies without community consultation. And that is honestly what has been lacking so much in so many law enforcement agencies, and even sometimes with the federal legislation that we've had, is that we have to involve community members and consult with them the practices that impact those people the most. And this bill has that.
Roy.
So I'm going to follow Cammie's lead and cheat a little bit here. It is one of those things where you kind of need all of this, but let me highlight the body cameras, just because mandating that federal officers have body cameras. I have the sad honor of working on a case right now where that is such an important piece of what happened, and we know that having this stuff on tape is so important. It really does change. I mean, the whole reason why the George Floyd case is everyone knows what happened there is because it was on tape. And officers, whether federal or state and local, should have body cameras. But the part I'm going to call out is the pattern and practice. And giving a subpoena authority to the special litigation section of the Civil Rights Division is huge, where they can go in and they can get the documents they need, and jurisdictions cannot push back. I've seen the work of the pattern and practice working in New Orleans, where they have one of the state-of-the-art model of intervention, of partner intervention. I've seen it work in Seattle. I've seen it work in Portland. I've seen it work in East Haven, Connecticut. I've seen it work all over this country. And it's so important to give them the authority to go into these departments and do good work. And this bill does that.
Alvin?
So as I spoke earlier about the independent prosecutor piece that jumped off the page to me, two other provisions that I really like, and I like because I'm hoping that other jurisdictions will look to them. They apply in the federal domain here, are just about how these cases, criminal cases, get litigated and what is the standard that will govern. So in many jurisdictions, so Graham v. Connors is the law, the Supreme Court decision. It governs what the jury instructions are, and this law goes from that standard, which is sort of does the officer sort of reasonably believe his or her lethal force to be necessary? I'm sort of parroting it a bit to making clear, and when I'm making clear, to changing the standard and heightening and saying it's got to be a matter of last resort, which I think you could read necessary to conclude that, but that's not how the courts have read it, and that's certainly not how it's been explained to the juries when I've been there. And so to say that an officer can, and again, it's only applying to federal law enforcement in this bill, that the use of lethal force has to be a matter of last resort, which I think if you polled most people and just asked, should I be able to kill someone? What should the rule be? Well, yeah, you can't do anything else. The only thing left to do, that's it. And so it to me has so much kind of compelling inherent logic, but it hasn't been the law. And so to have it apply here to federal officers, and then I hope that states will look to it and adopt it. And there's a similar provision, and the representative talked about Tamir Rice, and Tamir Rice comes to mind with risk creation. It says that for a federal charge of murder or manslaughter, if the officer creates the situation that leads to the need for force, it takes self-defense off the table as an option for the officer. And, we think of Tamir Rice and how the car pulled up, right on him. And then the sort of explanation was, well, we had nothing left to do. Well, your conduct created that situation. So those are two provisions that I think, as Roy mentioned earlier, the federal docket in criminal law is narrow compared to whole countries. So I'm hoping that Congress speaking in this way, other jurisdictions will look at it and say, okay, now we have the language, and now we also have Congress speaking. We're going to do this in our jurisdiction. So I hope to be looking back years from now and say this is a starting point of a sea change on these standards.
So one of the questions that we got are predictions about the ability to cultivate bipartisan support. And, it's interesting. We just moved a bill through Congress that enjoyed significant bipartisan support. We look at who's out protesting across the country. We see folks black, white, brown. We see multi-generational folks gathered and protesting. We see protests that are happening in urban areas, in rural areas, and everything in between. This moment does feel different, but how different things are inside the Beltway is probably a different question. Let's get a prediction or two from folks about the ability to get the bipartisan support that just this seems like a natural, easy thing, but what are your predictions?
Kristen, asking people to predict Congress is really not a fair question. Let me be honest. But look, this bill is just loaded with common sense. It's loaded with the things that law enforcement should have been doing on their own for decades. There's really nothing in this bill that I see that I'm like, you know what, that's wrong. That's going to make us less safe. I see everything in this bill as a huge step forward and where we need to go. And so you just hope that common sense prevails. You hope that people recognize this movement that we are seeing and they do the right thing. But to predict that they will do the right thing is an impossible task based on what we've seen the past few years.
And one thing that I would add is when I think about the possibility for bipartisan support, I agree with Roy in terms of, when you look at this, like who doesn't want better trained police, communities that are coming up with innovative ways to deal with issues and different standards. But when we've seen, as we have seen over the past few weeks, and this is what feels different to me about this moment in time, because we've come to this not with a blank slate. We've had Rodney King and everything with Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and all the names that we can't even name in the time that we have remaining. But my point is that never before have I seen the number of police chiefs and prosecutors and folks who have been involved inside of the criminal justice system to sit up and say, okay, there's something, we can do something better here. And so I think it's going to be the coalitions that we have with law enforcement leaders who understand that these things are necessary, and they're necessary because we were losing trust within, we have not had trust in a very long time in the Black community in particular. And we need to build that trust so that police officers and communities can create partnerships that will keep everyone safe.
Yeah.
I agree with Roy, and I've spent far less time in DC than he has. So I'm not going to try to make a prediction. But I will tie it to another lawyers committee priority, which is voting. So I had a conversation with a younger relative yesterday. She's a year and a half out of college, has been, engaging with her peers and talking about turning the energy from the streets and protests and continuing it to the ballot box. And, she was asking me, well, what are specific things I can tell people? Everyone says to go vote. What are the specific 3 things people should be voting about? And so I would hold up this bill, right? I don't know what's going to happen between now and November, but when people say, why should we vote? I would hold this bill up, right? Because this is a bill that needs to get passed. And I don't know whether the votes exist right now, but if they don't, I can think of a lot of reasons to vote, but I would put this near the top of the list.
Yeah, voting is one of the most powerful forms of protest. It absolutely is. And, we've got this new act which seeks to promote accountability, but the truth is that one way that we can all exercise agency and hold people accountable is at the ballot box. And so it's important for us to not lose sight of that. Thank you for lifting that up, Alvin. We still have primary elections happening across the country. We've got a general election in November. We've got elected officials here who are part of the equation, mayors who appoint police chiefs, mayors who have the ability to put in place, officials who fund the police department. The sheriff's position in many communities is an elected position, and they run the jails. The DA is an elected position. So these are all, voting is indeed a part of the equation. It's outside the context of the bill and brings us back to where we started at the beginning. This is a historic, comprehensive piece of legislation, but it doesn't alone do all of the work that needs to be done. And exercising our power at the ballot box this season is critically important. For people who are watching, we encourage you to jot this number down, 866-OUR-VOTE, 866-OUR-VOTE. We've got to make sure that we are registering people to vote and that we know how to vote amidst the current pandemic that's happening. So we're getting close to the end of our hour. There's some really great questions. I want to bring up this one. How can bills be pushed through regarding criminal justice, social and racial equality, and police reform without a big movement and protests like the current George Floyd protests? And I think that we have to give credit to the life and legacy of George Floyd. No doubt we are here because his life is the straw that broke the camel's back. That gruesome video that has now been seen all across the world is what proved to be the breaking point for our country. And I think there's no turning back, but we are here because of him. And there are people demonstrating and protesting as we speak, and we believe deeply at the Lawyers Committee in standing up to protect their rights. One step and action that we took last week was filing a lawsuit, Black Lives Matter DC versus Trump, taking on the administration for the actions that they've undertaken to silence peaceful demonstrators in violation of the First and Fourth Amendments of the Constitution. This is gross conduct that runs afoul of principles that lie at the heart of our democracy. And we've got to stand up for protesters because they are why we are having this conversation that we're having today. They are out lifting up the legacy of those who have sadly and tragically lost their life. I want to thank all of you for joining for this discussion. I want to thank all of those who are watching. There is work to be done. Congress will be holding a hearing on this bill, which we will circulate to participants after the end of the program on Wednesday. On Wednesday, there will be holding a hearing. There will be hearings coming up shortly thereafter in the Senate. Now is the time to weigh in and bring pressure to bear on your member of Congress who represents your community. I'm going to give you another number, 202-224-3121. 202-224-3121. Call that number and you can reach your member of Congress and let them know what you think about this bill. If there are issues that you think need to be fine-tuned, that weren't included, to offer your full support to urge your member to go on record with a position. Now is the moment to speak up and to be heard. Roy, Alvin, Cami, thanks to the three of you for the work that you do each and every day to fight for a more fair criminal justice system. I want to turn the floor over to Arthur Ago, who leads the Criminal Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee, to offer a brief word about the work that we'll be doing in the road ahead.
Thank you, Kristen. And I want to thank all the panelists for the important conversation that we're having here, and also everybody that's engaged in this important conversation nationally. What we recognize at the Lawyers Committee is that there needs to be a fundamental change in the relationship between the police around the country and communities of color, and in particular, Black communities in this country. The problem is that broken windows policing does not work. It has never worked. And unfortunately, notwithstanding some of the efforts of local officials, is still being used by local police departments. Mr. Floyd's case is a perfect example of broken windows policing, and it needs to end. What we at the Lawyers Committee are doing are looking at issues of police accountability. We have dedicated staff to look at how systems of police accountability have failed, from internal discipline within police departments to restrictions on civilian complaint review boards, to criminal court charges that are not being brought against police who violate people's rights, and to the restrictions that are imposed by the doctrine of qualified immunity in civil court. And in particular, and specifically, we are looking at police unions' outsized influence on all of those systems of accountability, and how the police unions have negatively affected our country's ability to create and sustain systems of accountability for police around the country. So we'll be working closely with you, obviously, Kristen, and all other players in this field, and our partners in the community to start examining these issues and doing work in these issues. So thank you very much.
And thanks to all who joined us today for this discussion. It's time to put an end to racial violence. It's time to put an end to police violence. We are a nation at a crossroads, but we know that together we can see progress, push this important piece of legislation to the finish line, and then continue to roll up our sleeves and do work in our communities to help transform the way that policing is carried out in our country. Thanks so much for joining today. Take care.